Okay, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai. One of my expertise is in the field called pattern recognition and mathematical analysis, so I'll try to keep it brief. But the objectives of this study were pretty focused to essentially perform an initial analysis on Maricopa County and to identify any anomalies and to provide an explanation for those anomalies. So that's what this today's discussion is focused on. At a very high level, many people probably know these numbers. If you look at the about 2.6 million people are registered to vote in Maricopa County. In this election, 80.5% of them cast ballots, as you can see there. And this is not showing the data for, let's say, the independent or green parties, but 49.8% went to Biden and 47.6% to President Trump. So that was the reported results from the Secretary of State. The other important thing to note is that just to get it, one of the important features that you can look at in a election is a distribution of votes by party affiliation. So in this case, there was 35.3% of Republicans who voted, 31.3% of Democrats, 32.3% of independents, a small percentage of libertarians. That gives a total distribution. We'll come back to this, why this is important in this analysis. So what I want to first begin by having people put their attention on this chart. What this is we're literally taking all the data provided by the Secretary of State across the 743 precincts in Maricopa County, and we're literally recreating the election. And there are two curves here. One is the curve for President Trump, which is a red curve, and the blue curve is a curve for Mr. Biden. And as we move from left to right, what we're doing is we're starting with precincts which have low number of votes to precincts which have high number of votes. And we're literally counting the vote totals and summing them up together. When you get to the end here, you get the actual election results. So 49% for Mr. Biden and 47.6% for Mr. Trump. So these curves in many ways show the dynamic of the election as you move from the precincts from low vote counts to high, and you're essentially adding them up. So when you look at this curve in pattern recognition and pattern analysis, one of the things you try to understand is anomalies and the normal condition. So this is what we're calling the normal condition. In science, we'd call it the control. And we're literally looking at two important features. There's a shape of this curve, and there's the sequence and how this curve is developed. So in the analysis here, what we wanted to do was we wanted to see if we can reproduce the curve for President Trump and the curve for Mr. Biden by looking at the demographic of voters based on party affiliation, because that's one of the most easily accessible or one of the most prominent features in an election. So towards this, we initially did a initial analysis of looking at voter turnout in a precinct, percent voter turnout. So every dot here represents a particular precinct, and you're looking at the percent voter turnout in a precinct along the y-axis, and along the x-axis simply the percent registered Republicans in a precinct. And what's interesting is you see a positive correlation. The more percentage of Republicans in a precinct, in fact, voter turnout is going up. Alternatively, when we looked at the percentage voter turnout in a precinct by percent registered Democrats in a precinct, you see a negative relationship. As the percentage of Democrats in a precinct increases, each blue dot is a precinct, you see a negative correlation with voter turnout. And similarly, we see the same behavior in the registered independents in a precinct. Voter turnout, and you see the negative correlation. So in summary, for Republicans, where the percent turnout positively correlates with percentage registered Republicans in a precincts, for Democrats and independents, the percent turnout negatively correlates with percent registered Democrats and percent registered independents in precincts. So that's just giving you the feature of what was taking place in Maricopa County. Now, getting back to this, we have the capability, the computer affords us the opportunity to do what we call scenario testing. What are the potential scenarios of distribution of Republicans, Democrats, independents, libertarians, and Greens, that if you were to look at the potential infinite possibility spaces, we haven't done all of them, but in the time that we have, what are the percentages of distributions of voters that would give rise to produce President Trump's curve here, and what are the percentages that would give rise of those allocations of Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Greens, and Libertarians to give rise to Mr. Biden's percentage. And the reason we want to do this is to look at the plausibility of these results. Is it plausible that you could have some reasonable distribution of Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Green to generate this very particular slope and these curves to get this net result? And remember, again, we're going from precincts from left to right, we're accumulating votes. So this is really 743 different data points. So what we first did, just to give you an idea, this is one of the potential scenarios where we're looking at, in the case of Democrats, we're looking at a split of votes between Mr. Biden and Trump of 20% to 80%, of Republicans between 80% to 20%, and of the Independents 70-30, Libertarians 0-100, and Green 100-0. This is one of the computer simulations. Like this, a computer can do far better than I could do sitting here. And what you see is the green line is trying to match Mr. Biden's blue line, and you can see it's way off. And the purple line is trying to match the red line. So obviously these aren't matching, because again, we wanted to see if we could overlay on those. So here's another potential scenario. In this case, we're looking at Biden-Trump voter distribution of Democrats by 80-20, Republican 20-80, the Independents 30-60, Libertarians 10-90, 100-0. And in this case, the blue line here, the purple line here, is at least nearer the red line, and the green line is getting closer to Mr. Biden. So again, the green and the purple are the simulated versions. Then we do another example. Well, this is getting a little bit closer. We see 100% Democrat, 0% Trump for Democrat distribution relative to Republicans, 20-80 split, 36%, 58% on the Independents, and so on. But it's still not matching, even though it's getting close here. You notice the slopes aren't matching. Well, we try a different case, 100% Democrat, 0% Biden-Trump, Republican 0-100, and so on. Still doesn't match. This iteration process, again, with the computer was done, and the only one that we were able to come close to matching was this. And I want everyone to look at this carefully. So out of all the potential universe, which we've done, and we're going to continue doing this, by no means is this done, we find that the interesting possibility we find here is when the Democrat percentage is 130% Mr. Biden and negative 30% Mr. Trump, and the Republican percentage is 0-100, the Independent is 30%, 58%, Libertarian 0-60, 60-0. But what's extraordinary about this graph, again, we went through many iterations, it matches perfectly, near perfectly. The slopes match, the curves match, the shape match. So what this tells us is that this demographic distribution of allocation of party affiliations is what can generate this. And I find it highly implausible, because this means that Mr. Biden got 130% of Democrat voters and negative 30%, and President Trump got negative 30%. So how is this possible? So how is this quote unquote result possible? Well, one possibility could be there's a demographic within the independent voters, which is this group here, okay, this 38, 58%, not visible in our model, who voted for Biden. Again, we would need to get more access to data, which is, by the way, very difficult to get access to. Another possibility is that Mr. Biden's actual votes were multiplied by 1.3, which is 130%, meaning each single vote Mr. Biden received, each single vote he actually received became 1.3 reported votes. There was an increase in a weighting of a vote that was given to Mr. Biden, and President Trump's votes are reduced by that 0.3 or 30% gained by Mr. Biden. Simply put, you could call this vote swapping, or there could be a combination of both. So that's what we have discovered today. But this combination, out of all the possibilities to match this curve perfectly, is the only one we found so far. and the demographic distribution that it asserts seems highly implausible. But again, we need to do more research. One is, again, as I mentioned, that there could be certain groups of independent voters that are not visible in the model, or it could be vote swapping, or all three. And I'll end on that note.
All right, Dr. Shiva. I'm looking at Mr. Giuliani, and I see he's been scratching some things out here. I'm pretty sure you have a question or two.
I do, sir.
Please, sir.
Doctor, it's Rudy Giuliani. How are you?
How are you, Mayor Giuliani?
Can I just ask you, how did you get to that calculation where Trump received minus 30% of the Democrat vote? Can you explain to us in a way that we can understand how you got to that calculation?
Sure. So let me go back to it, if I can go back to it. So think of this, Mayor Giuliani, as if you think about this, this is a curve that represents the actual vote, what's called the cumulative vote count for Mr. Biden and President Trump. Okay, so this is the control. This is what actually occurred on election night. Does that make sense? And what we're attempting to do in mathematics, using mathematics, you can do what's called curve fitting, where you can change certain variables to attempt to fit this curve. The variables we are changing here, which cannot be done, manually, but the computer is essentially changing the possibilities of different levers, a percentage of Democrats who voted for President Trump, the percent of Democrats who voted for Mr. Biden, the percent of Republicans who voted for Biden, the percent of Republicans who voted for Trump, the percent of independents who voted for Biden, the percent of independents who voted for Trump, and so on. So it's a solving where, remember in algebra where you could multiply variables by different equations, and you're trying to match this curve. So the computer is doing this, Mayor Giuliani, and so that's why I'm showing you these different possibilities. Now there's hundreds of thousands that the computer is running through to figure out what possible, as you can see here, what possible combination of these would lead to this. And the only one we were able to find was this. I hope that explains it. We're looking at the computer trying to find combinations of these vote allocations that could perfectly reproduce this result.
So a vote for Biden would actually be 1 1/3 vote. Is that correct?
Yeah, 1 3/10, right. So
1 3/10.
So Biden got one vote.
1 3/10, and a vote for Trump would be 1.
A vote for Trump would be whatever the president got, if he got 100 votes, reduced by 30% of what Mr. Biden got. Basically, the president's vote is linked to the vote that Mr. Biden got. So if Biden got 100 votes and his went up by 1.3, which means it took 30% of the votes were reduced that would go to President Trump. So basically, votes are being eaten from President Trump and handed over to Mr. Biden. That's the only way to one possibility of explaining.
Did you discuss this at all with Colonel Waldron?
I received a text message from this earlier, and in preparation for this, I wasn't able to get to him, but I'm willing to discuss that with him.
Well, he reached a very similar conclusion in a different way, that the votes for Biden were valued within the computer algorithm as higher than the votes for Trump. Could you accomplish that within a computer that you had gotten control of?
Well, one of the important things to recognize is that what we do know is, starting in 2002, Mayor Giuliani, that these voting vendors, that was brought out in one of the Diebold manuals, have a feature called the weighted race feature. The weighted race feature, it's a documented feature. And the weighted race feature basically says that the feature in the software, which the secretaries of state have certified, knowingly or maybe unconsciously, but they must have certified these electronic voting system software, has a feature called a weighted race feature, which allows a voter's vote to be or a candidate's votes to be multiplied. So what that means is the central principle that Justice Earl Warren ruled on in 1964, one person, one vote, or clarified that, can be violated. It can be one person, not one vote. And that is one explanation of this. But the important feature I think people in the public need to understand is these software systems, the electronic voting software systems, have a documented feature called a weighted race feature. So the implementation of this is very possible. In fact, it's a documented feature starting as early as 2002.
Giving the right message matters.